We welcome you to our Wednesday night time. I almost allowed the start time to sneak up on me, but we're blessed to have those of you that are with us connecting online, and I'm always encouraged to see faces in the room. It is a blessing to have you with us. On the front end, let me thank, of course, for last week, Dr. Landon Jones, really the last two Wednesdays, he provided lessons in my absence as my wife and I were away. And I know you were encouraged just to be able to reflect in a fresh way on the Ten Commandments. Oftentimes we overlook the message of what God was asking His Old Testament people to do, and certainly the implications for us as New Testament followers of Jesus. But I'm thankful for Landon and all the ways that he encourages and teaches here at the church. Today, though, I want to raise a question. It's really not a curiosity question on the part of something that you like or do, but just kind of a general question to see what you might already know. And if you're watching online, you can share your response to the question in the chat box. But the question is this: I'm curious, do you know what a mulligan is? What is a mulligan? Now, if, again, you're watching online, I will be looking to see what you describe in the chat box. For those of you that are here, how do you define a mulligan? Who's going to kick it off? Yeah. A bad golf shot, okay.
You shoot, you don't like it, you do it again. I'll say a do-over.
Yeah, the term has grown to mean a broader application. It developed in the golf world. There is a story, supposedly, that the practice of the mulligan developed because of a Canadian golfer by the name of David Mulligan, who happened to go up to the first tee, and he drove off the tee, and the shot didn't go as he wanted it to. And though he was playing with the foursome, without thinking, he immediately grabbed another ball, put it on the tee, and hit it. And one of those that were with him asked, "Well, what was that?" And he said, "Well, that was my corrective shot." And then he thought quick on his feet. No, that was a mulligan. And supposedly, that's how the practice in the golf world of the mulligan developed. And it's in principle, if you have a bad shot, you're potentially afforded the opportunity for a do-over. I think the concept has reached beyond the golf world. You hear people, whether it's at work or in some other setting, they say, I want a mulligan, or I want, what's implied by that is a do-over. Now, just to stay with regard to the golf discussion, are you familiar with then what a Gilligan is? Now, when I heard that expression, I thought of the sitcom character, that silly man, Gilligan. But those of you that play golf, the Gilligan is the complete opposite of the mulligan, where you actually hit a really good shot, whether it's a drive or maybe it was an exceptional putt, and someone in your foursome says, "I want a Gilligan." And what that requires is, though you hit a really good shot, you have to hit the shot again. It's not a do-over because you had a bad shot. It's a do-over because someone wants to see if you can do it twice in terms of the good shot. And I just thought that was kind of a clever play. But I want us to think about this idea of the mulligan as we move into tonight's lesson. Because the truth is, as we live our lives, we really don't get to have mulligans, do we? Though some people might give us a second chance or a third chance based on what the situation is, the fact is, whatever we did has put something into motion, and ultimately we're going to have to live our life based on what resulted. We have to play the ball, returning to the golfing analogy, where it lies. That is just the reality of life. You don't get mulligans when it comes to the choices we make. Even though I think everyone in this room would likely be able to point to a dozen life moments where they wish they had a do-over, where they acted in a way or reacted in a way that now, reflecting back on their lives, they wish they could do that over. I'll be candid. if I had a list surveying my life, I bet you there are at least 100 mulligans I wish I could have had in life, where I could go back and say, I would like that back, or want to try that again, at least that. But with that in our mind, let me pray for us as we move into tonight's lesson and ask the Lord's encouragement as we return to the study of the life of Moses. Father, first, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with these that have gathered and those that have joined us online. I'm thankful for Dr. Jones and how he provided leadership in my absence, but I'm blessed to again reconnect with these. And Lord, even as we've talked about wishing that we could replay an episode in our life or to have a mulligan with regard to some life experience, we all know that that just isn't the nature of living. And I pray that tonight, as we look at Moses and consider what admittedly is a great disappointment in his life with regard to his action, I pray we might learn from his experience. I pray we might gain the perspective, the insight that would help us to relate to you and to move through life in ways that allow you to further make a difference in who we are. I'm grateful for Moses' example, both in terms of those exemplary ways that he's modeled faith and obedience, but also this evening where, based upon his actions, he placed himself in the midst of a painful, disappointing situation. And I just pray that we would gain the appropriate understanding based upon his story. I ask these things in Jesus' name, amen. For those of you that may be with us for the first time tonight or that are connecting with us online for the very first time, for really since early March, we've been surveying the life of the Old Testament man by the name of Moses. You can't read through the Old Testament and not appreciate that he indeed is one of the notable figures in Scripture. And we've been looking at his life from the perspective of lessons that we might learn based upon what the Bible portrays to be descriptive of him, based upon his humble heart. Indeed, in Numbers 12, he is characterized to be the most humble of individuals. And I've emphasized throughout this series what is meant by humility isn't that he was self-effacing, but rather that he was God-dependent. Moses discovered that for him to fulfill what God was asking him to do, he absolutely had to depend on God's wisdom, on God's power, on God's presence. And because of his experiences, I'm convinced we can gain some perspective that can guide us in how we relate to God and how we respond to the situations of life around us. Now, we're moving toward the end of this series. In fact, next Wednesday night, we'll conclude the series by reflecting upon how, even in his death, Moses teaches us something about how we should live. And so I hope you'll be back next week. But tonight, I want us to consider an episode in Moses' life that, I'm going to be honest, it just makes my heart sad. I admire Moses for being an extraordinary man of faith who sought to be used of God. Even at times when emotionally it was hard on him, he just pressed through. He modeled obedience and faith. But tonight, we're going to look at an experience in his life where he reacts poorly, where he engages a situation in a way that would cost him negatively. Before we look at, though, this negative encounter or episode, I want us to take a few moments and review what's brought us to this place, and this certainly would benefit those that have been unable to be with us in previous weeks. So where are we in the story? Well, 3 weeks ago, when I was with you last, we noted that God brought Israel to the land of promise, but they refused to trust the Lord and chose to turn away. Now, as I make that initial point, let me note to those of you that are online, you may want an outline as we provide that from week to week, and I think that will be particularly helpful for this evening's lesson. You should watch for a link, and you can right-click on that and download it with you. And those of you that are here, there are outlines over on the table to my left. But as I said in the outline, when I was last with you, we focused in on what had to be an incredibly disappointing moment in Moses, God's servant, in his life. Because God had called him, if you recall, from the burning bush to be his instrument that would deliver the children of Israel from their captivity, so that ultimately he could, Moses, lead them into the land of promise. It was all about crossing over the river Jordan and beginning to experience the provision of God as God reestablished the descendants of Abraham in the land of promise. That was Moses' mission. But as we observed in Numbers 13, God brings them to the river Jordan. Moses encourages them to cross over. But following a rather pessimistic assessment of the people's ability to face the inhabitants of the land, the children of Israel chose collectively to turn away. They would not trust God enough to face the challenges in front of them. They chose rather to turn away. Now, their refusal to trust the Lord resulted in God initially responding with the desire to judge them. I mean, they're rejecting everything God had delivered them to do. And God, as you read it for yourself in Numbers 14, announces to Moses, I'm just going to destroy them. I'm going to judge them collectively for this act of defiance. Yet Moses, as he hears God's pronouncement, humbles himself before the Lord and intercedes successfully on the people's behalf. Because of Moses' intercession, God's judgment is averted. That is another moment in time where we see in the example of Moses the kind of example we want to follow. We want to be that type of intercessor. When we see someone that is really in a mess, like Moses, we want to come to the Lord and ask, I want you to forgive them. And God did pardon the people for their refusal to move into the land. But as I note in the outline, though forgiven, the unbelieving generation will not enter the land of promise. Yes, God forgives them, but there would still be a remaining consequence. Let me read that for you. I included the passage in the handout. It's recorded in Numbers 14, verse 20. Then the Lord said, he's speaking to Moses, I have pardoned according to your word. In other words, because of your intercession, Moses, I will not judge them and destroy them, but truly, the Lord adds, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. I wanted to include this in our review because I want to remind us that even though God forgives a person, and we're grateful that he does, oftentimes there may be consequences that remain. We're deceiving ourselves if we believe that turning to God for forgiveness will automatically result in all of the negative consequences of our actions being removed. That's not what the Bible describes as the nature of forgiveness. Let me, however, add what forgiveness does afford is this. Though I may still have to face negative consequences because God forgives me, he will join me in that and help me face the consequence. That's the idea. And here we have with the children of Israel, God saying, I will forgive them for their refusal to trust me. But there is a consequence. They will not be permitted to cross over into the land of promise. Interestingly, if you read on for yourself, once the people realize the seriousness of their mistake, you know what they try to do? They try to cross over on their own. And they suffer a miserable defeat. Only to further illustrate, listen, there will be instances where we fail and God forgives, but the fact is there may still remain some consequences that are present that God desires now to help us deal with. And as you move forward in the story, that's what we'll discover, that God shows grace and mercy in ways that helps the people deal with the consequences of their action. But they will not cross over into the land. In the outline, I kind of tie all of this together by emphasizing the following lesson, and it's one that we've touched on early in the series, and the lesson is this: we're wise to note that God means what he says, and God acts accordingly. When God makes a statement, declares a promise, or ushers a command, just know within your heart, God means what he says. And you can be assured God will act according to what he says. And as you move further into the events that follow, that's exactly what we observe. 40 years pass, returning to the handout, and the unbelieving generation dies in the wilderness. Now, most of them will die of natural causes. Some of them, if you read the in-between chapters from chapter 14 to chapter 20, you'll find there were some episodes where there were incidents where some tried to rally against God and against Moses, and they suffered a judgment out of that. But generally speaking, the unbelieving adult generation that refused to cross over into the land of promise, they experienced God's help and support for 40 years in the wilderness. He continued to provide them daily food with the manna. He continued to watch over them and guide them through Moses, their leader. But they would, by natural causes, eventually die. And that's what brings us to Numbers chapter 20, where the death of Moses' sister Miriam is recorded. Listen to what's described. Numbers chapter 20, verse 1, and the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now, there's some information that's in between the lines here that I want you to appreciate. When you come to Numbers chapter 20 from, say, Numbers chapter 14, 40 years have passed. The wilderness experience, by and large, has now taken place. And as I indicated, the unbelieving adult generation that turned away have, generally speaking, died. And now we're told that even Moses' sister Miriam dies. And in a way, she symbolizes, I think, that unbelieving group that had to suffer the loss of having to spend the remainder of their lifetime in the wilderness. And yet it's worth noting that Miriam dies when God now has brought them to the place where he's begun to reposition the next generation to enter into the land. Do recall it was at Kadesh that the spies were sent into the land 40 years earlier. It was at Kadesh Barnea that the people refused to trust God to cross over. So in a way, God has brought them now back full circle. And of all things, Miriam, Moses' sister, dies there and is buried there. And it's almost as if it's kind of a twofold point of reference. It reminds us in a generational way of those that have suffered loss, but it also gives us a little glimmer of what's about to happen, where God intends now to lead the next generation across the River Jordan into the land of promise, which, as I note in the outline, God is preparing the next generation to enter the land. And from Numbers chapter 20 until we get into the Old Testament book of Joshua, which we'll not do in this series, but from Numbers 20 to Joshua 1, you have God now getting the people ready. That next group, he's seeking to instill within them what's necessary to accomplish what he always intended. That said, what then is described in Numbers 20 can be a little disheartening. God's positioned the next generation to cross over, and what happens? Well, in a summary way, what we observe is that the people find themselves again in need and revolt against Moses. Listen how it's described. I'm reading from Numbers 20, verse 2. And I remind you, this is the next generation. This is the children of those that had refused to cross over. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled. Now, in the Hebrew text, that's the Hebrew term reeve. It's a strong word. I want you to know that. It's not just like they're complaining. No. Symbolically speaking, this term would be descriptive of grabbing hold of someone's hair and pulling back on it. It's a very aggressive opposition to. That this group of people now are positioning themselves against God's appointed leader, Moses. And they say to him, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord." Here they're referring to those instances from Numbers 14 to Numbers 20, where there were larger groups of people in their rebellion that God judged directly, and they died. And in a passing way, this next generation that God desires to cross into the land of promise are actually complaining about where they are, and they're actually insinuating, we wish we had just died with those other groups. But they go on. As they speak to Moses, they say, "Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you," speaking to Moses, "made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Now, as you listen to what they're venting toward God's servant Moses, what I want you to appreciate is this. The next generation displays some of the same quality as their parents. I'm not sure at this stage I'm recognizing much of a difference. In fact, returning to the header where I suggested the people find themselves again in need and again revolt. We've seen this play out before. Let's break down their complaint. What we hear from them is this: they doubt the Lord's good intention. Need I remind you that it's God that has been leading them for 40 years. If you recall the way that would work, they had constructed a tabernacle so that some expression of the glory or the physical glory of God could be manifest in their midst. And whenever this presence would kind of rise up from the tabernacle, the people knew it's time to move. And they would physically follow this manifestation of God's glory from place to place. All right, so think about this. It's God's presence that's led them now to a place where there is no water. What is God doing? I should stress with you, God's placed them there strategically. Back in Exodus 17, with regard to his parents, you have almost the identical set of circumstances. With their parents, God delivers them from Egypt, leads them through the Dead Sea miraculously, and then in a relatively short period of time, he places them in a setting where there's limited water. There's no water. And he did that so that the people would turn to him and trust him, ask him for help. But in Exodus 17, they reacted just like their children are now reacting. Instead of humbling themselves before the Lord, they begin to express their frustration and disappointment. They begin to position themselves against God, when all the time God is trying to teach them, here, I want you to depend on me, because when you cross over into the land of promise, you're going to have to rely on my power and provision. So he brings them to a place again where they're in need, and tragically, the children of the unbelieving generation act just like their parents. They question God's good intention, and they target Moses with regard to their angst. They question, why are we even following you? And what's confounding is what they say. The next generation fails to appreciate the consequences of where they are as a result of their parents' former actions. They're pointing at Moses and saying, why in the world have you brought us to this evil place? Why aren't we enjoying the abundance of a bountiful land? Why are we here? And what's the answer to that question? Because your parents refused to cross over 40 years earlier. Moses wasn't leading them around in the wilderness in a meandering way just because God was just playing games with them. They had rejected God's command to cross into the land, and they are now generationally suffering the consequence. And instead of the children appreciating the cause and effect of their parents' choices, they blame Moses instead. By the way, I think there's a lot of that mindset in our day and time. Few individuals are willing to be honest enough to admit, I am where I am because of the choices that I've made. The bad choices that I've made. And we want to blame God for some of the difficulties that, frankly, we've brought on ourselves. Well, that's where the children of Israel are. They're attacking Moses. But I want you to appreciate Moses' reaction. What you will see is Moses and Aaron, in response to what they're saying, place themselves again before the Lord. See, if you've been with us, many of you will recall, this is Moses' normal mode of operation. When there's a question, Moses will make his way to the presence of the Lord to seek counsel. And here, that's exactly what happens. Moses, along with Aaron, does what he usually does. He places himself before the Lord. Let me read it for you, starting in verse 6 of the same chapter. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock. Now notice this, take the staff, but talk to the rock. Tell the rock before the eyes of the people to yield its water. In other words, God instructs Moses, I want you to speak to the rock. The people need water. Moses, speak to the rock. So, going on, you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. Now, as I read God's instructions, would you agree with me that's, though it's a little odd, it's certainly clear. God asked his servant to do what would not be natural, to go up to a notable rock where the people would gather, and to speak to it with God's promise that water will then flow forth. Something miraculous is going to happen. It's worth noting that when you go back to Exodus 17, when a similar episode took place with the parents of this group of people, on that occasion, God actually instructed Moses to strike the rock. You can go back and read that for yourself. But in Numbers 20, no, Moses, you're not going to strike the rock. Talk to it. Tell the rock to bring forth water. And because of who I am, Moses, you can know I'm going to provide for the people. The water will flow. God's instructions are clear. But let me interject. His instructions are not what Moses expected. Moses and Aaron, after the people kind of revolt, go to the tabernacle and they bow before the Lord. And it says, the presence of the Lord, the glory of the Lord appears. God explains to Moses exactly what he needs to do. But I would interject, it is not what Moses expected. Now, where am I going with this? Again, some might accuse me of reading between the lines, but stay with me. The people have attacked Moses' leadership among them. This isn't the first time that this has happened. And on other occasions, God, in response to the people's revolt, has acted in a way that elevated Moses in the eyes of the people. He impressed upon them that Moses is their leader. And it seems like in this moment, that's what Moses is expecting. That God is going to confront the people for what they've said against him and reestablish his leadership, and then perhaps address the need concerning the water. Moses, it seems, is expecting something different than what he receives. And let's just be, I think, honest as you survey Moses' interaction with the people. There have frequently been these struggles, and there have been occasions where, in fact, last time I shared with you 3 weeks ago, there was a point where Moses was so frustrated by it all, he turned to God, and it's recorded in Numbers 11, in essence said, why am I having to handle this? Why do I have to carry this group of people around and care for them like a mother would a child? Why me, Lord? And here we are again, and it seems as if Moses is expecting that the Lord is somehow going to elevate him. But that's not what God asked him to do. Rather, in fact, Moses takes matters into his own hands. Returning to the passage, look at verses 11 and 12. It's in your outline. Oh, excuse me, I was jumping backward. Verses 9 and 11. What we see is Moses does the unexpected. And what was that? Moses disobeys the Lord. That is recorded in verses 9 through 11 in Numbers 20. Listen to how it's portrayed. And Moses, having received his instruction, took the staff from the Lord as God commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, again as God instructed. And Moses said, observe, to them, to the people, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff. twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. God explains to Moses what he is to do. Moses refuses to do what God asks. Now you say, well, does some of it? Moses disobeys the Lord. Let's break that down. First, in anger, I want you to notice Moses speaks to the people instead of the rock. I mean, God was pretty explicit. Go to the rock, speak to the rock. Moses instead gathers the people. He goes to the rock and angrily speaks to the people. Now, I interject that he does so with anger based upon what's recorded in Psalm 106. The psalmist gives us a little further perspective on what's going on in Moses' heart and mind. Listen to what it describes. Psalm 106:32, they, referring to the people, angered him, Moses, at the waters of Meribah, and it went ill with Moses on their account, for they made his spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. As I'm reading this, maybe you're thinking to yourself, what is going on? Is this Moses, the same Moses that has interceded for this rebellious people over and over and over again? The answer is yes. But here in this moment, something has changed within Moses' mind and heart. What's happened? Well, let me remind you, his sister died. I think the order of these events are not just coincidental. They're giving you a sense of what's going on in Moses' life. He's still grieving the death of his older sister, the woman that has been a very significant part of his life in notable ways. She was the older sister that watched over him as a young child when he was placed in the basket in the River Nile. His sister has died. He's grieving. And yet, in the midst of his sorrow and grief, what are the people doing? Supporting him? No. Challenging him. Questioning him. And in the midst of all of these emotions, Moses just kind of reaches the breaking point. And he lashes out at the people. He voices his frustration. He says to them, listen, you want us to give you water from this rock? Did you notice where the emphasis was? It was on him and on Aaron, not on the Lord. In anger, Moses speaks to the people instead of the rock. And worse, in disobedience to the Lord, Moses strikes the rock. What did God ask him to do? Speak to it. What did Moses choose to do? Strike it. Maybe someone that would defend Moses would say, well, again, he was just doing what he did before. Listen to me. God was very clear. Moses thought he knew better. He struck the rock. And nothing happened. If you could, try to envision this scene. All the people have gathered around. Moses has vented his frustration. You want us to bring about some water? Watch this. Bang! Nothing happens. Now, Moses, at this point, has to feel a little unsettled. The people are beginning to question what in the world is going on, and what does Moses then do? He strikes it a second time. Now, I'm reading between the lines. I can't help but think, given his state of mind, in anger, he struck it a second time. And what resulted? Okay, let's look at the results. First, God provides water to the people in his mercy, despite the people's rebellion and Moses' disobedience. Moses disobeys the Lord. The people are in rebellion. What does God do? He shows mercy. He allows the water to flow. And not just to trickle. The description is straightforward. It flows out abundantly, and the congregation drank to their fill, and even the livestock had more than enough water. God met the need despite Moses and the people. And can I remind us all that often is how God relates to his people? His mercy and grace are new every morning. He seeks to help us, to encourage us, often despite us. That certainly is the case here. But there's more concerning the results. Underscoring his holiness, the Lord then holds Moses and Aaron accountable for their actions. Look again at the handout and listen to what's recorded. Verse 12, and the Lord, as the water is flowing, said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. God addresses Moses and Aaron and explains there's consequences to what you did. You will not cross over into the land of promise with the assembly of the people. The fact is, Moses and Aaron's refusal to trust and honor the Lord cost them the land of promise. Now, if you have been with us from the start, this may be a little unsettling. Because Moses has been the poster child of humility and obedience. He has modeled for us what it means to draw near to God. Constantly, he was willing to intercede for those that were turning away from God. He had proven himself to be faithful over and over and over again. And now, because he struck the rock, God says, no, you can't go over. Again, more than a few would probably want to argue that just doesn't seem fair. I mean, one failure disqualified him? Well, let's step back from that. It could be argued there have been a number of instances when Moses allowed his anger to get the best of him. I mean, let's go all the way back to Egypt before he fled to Midian. What did Moses do in anger? He attacked an Egyptian who was oppressing a Hebrew and killed him. It forced Moses to have to run away, yet God in his mercy and grace claims him and begins to work with him and bring him to a place where he could accomplish what God promised would be. But do appreciate his anger drove him to a foolish action. Or how about this? At Mount Sinai, Moses ascends the mountain to meet with the Lord. The people down below, they rebel. They worship this golden calf that they've created. Moses comes down. He hears the ruckus of the revelry below. And what does Moses do? In anger, he casts down the stone tablets that the Lord had given him, where God had written it out of his own power, the testimony of the Ten Commandments. He cast them to the ground, and they broke up. Now again, in God's mercy and grace, God allowed Moses to come back onto the mountain. Now this time he had to actually bring with him some stone tablets that God then would replace what Moses in his anger cast down. But are you seeing a pattern here? See, anger is a dangerous emotion. It will lead us to react in ways that often will be to our loss. And here we are at a very significant point in time when God is preparing his people to move into the land. And he needs Moses to model what? Humility and obedience. What does Moses do instead? He allows his emotions to get the best of him, and he lashes out in anger. And what does God do? He says to Moses, there's consequences to that. Now, some may, again, look at this and, well, what did he really do that was wrong? Well, let's break it down. What Moses does, as God describes it, is really twofold, a negative thing. He first of all says to Moses that, Moses, you didn't trust me. Verse 12, because you did not believe in me, you didn't do what I asked. You didn't trust me. Now, maybe what's going on in Moses' mind is, once more, he had a different expectation of what God would ask. And because he envisioned a different situation, he decided that he knew what was best, and he ignored what God asked. I don't know if you figured out yet, but you could pretty much trace every act of disobedience to distrust. Why does a person disobey? Down deep in their mind or heart, they've concluded they know what's best and they do what they think is best. What is that? That's called unbelief. You are not trusting God about what he has said. On this occasion, Moses and Aaron along with him proved by their actions they did not trust God's word enough to do it. They did what they felt was best. But honestly, that's not the worst of it. As God describes, he says, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land. See, the larger issue was, in the presence of the assembly, Moses refused to relate to God as God, to treat him as holy. And God clearly explains to Moses, that is unacceptable of my leaders. You dishonored me in the eyes of my people. You're supposed to be modeling to them faith, humility, obedience. You modeled the opposite. Just to give you a further context, I think the seriousness of the consequence has a parallel. Do you remember in Leviticus chapter 11 when Aaron's two sons offered an inappropriate sacrifice on the altar in the tabernacle? Remember that? We looked at that episode. Nadab and Abihu, two unusual names. God had designed the tabernacle. He had explained as clear as possible what the people should do, what the priests should do. But Aaron's two sons did what? They decided that they knew what was best. They would offer what they wanted to offer, and they suffered a severe penalty for it. God struck them down. So if you look at them as an example, here they refuse to treat the Lord as holy. If you use them as an example, I don't know about you, it sounds like Moses and Aaron experienced a little mercy there. God didn't strike them down. He did, however, impose a consequence. They would not cross over. One further thought there, if I may. I remind you of a principle that Jesus introduced to his disciples in Luke chapter 12, to whom much is given, much is required. And in a real way, that's what's going on with Moses here. He has served in a unique role. He is to model humility and faith and obedience. And yet, in a rather dramatic way, he dishonors the Lord. And God lays out for Moses and Aaron alike, and he collaborated with Moses in the disobedience, that they indeed would suffer loss. They would not cross over into the land. If you think about what happened 40 years earlier, the parents of this generation suffered the loss of the land for largely the same reason. They didn't trust the Lord. They did not treat the Lord as holy. And as a result, they were not permitted to cross over. Well, let's close by considering some lessons that, at least from my perspective, stand out based upon this just painful episode in the life of Moses. What are the lessons? Well, first, please don't be surprised. Even the best among us falter. When I look at Moses, at least from my perspective, he certainly stands out as one of the best among the best. There's too many instances of his life modeling faith, humility, and obedience that you can't ignore how notable an example he has been. But not here. Not now. And in a sobering way, it just reminds us that even the best among us can falter. I feel it important to stress that because in our day and time, if we're not careful, we elevate individuals to a pedestal. We pretend that these individuals don't suffer the same pressures and weaknesses and hurts and struggles that others experience. And so in our mind, we imagine that it's impossible that that individual would ever falter in a way that would dishonor the Lord. Maybe based on Moses' example, we need to step back and just remind ourselves that our humanity, our weakness, it's present among us all. I was blessed to have still blessed to have a father who models faith, who's exemplified devotion. But as his son, I can truthfully say my dad's not perfect. And as a father of 3 children, if you really want to understand the frailty of man, I guarantee you they would say of their dad, he's not perfect. So just be careful and mindful, and even the best among us may falter. Second, we should guard our hearts during times of high emotion and loss. I want you to understand, from Moses' perspective, I think he was still grieving. If you've ever suffered the loss of someone you love deeply, grief is a force that you do not manage. It pretty much dictates high points and low points. And I'm not trying to make excuse for Moses. I just want you to realize he was at a place emotionally where emotions were high. And if we look at his experience, that should instruct us. We should guard our hearts during times of high emotion and times of loss. If you find yourself really experiencing strong emotion, probably you want to find some quiet places with the Lord and ask God to protect your heart, to guide your steps. Because frequently, during those types of experiences, we're going to find ourselves more vulnerable to react in ways that maybe later we would regret. Third, looking at his example, acting in anger is never a good idea. It's just not. James states it for us, James 1, verse 19 and 20. Know this, he writes, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, For, notice, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. I know there probably is at least someone listening or with us tonight that thinks, no, I think sometimes anger can be used for good because it can move you to take action. But listen to me, though your anger may cause you to focus in on an injustice or a wrong, do realize when you act in anger, it will always be in an amplified way. You're going to say something or do something in a way that will not accomplish the very thing you're trying to achieve. Rather than allowing your emotion to drive the action, again, get alone with the Lord. Ask the Lord to bring your emotion under control and then seek wisdom to know what to do. But when you act, do not act in anger. Because James spells it out. The anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. It doesn't. Inevitably, there's going to be somebody that points to Jesus cleansing the temple, turning over the tables. They say, well, Jesus acted in anger, and I'm just going to follow Jesus. I challenge you, go back to the Gospels, read those accounts. You're never going to find any mention of anger in any of the passages described. Now, in John's account, with the first cleansing of the temple, he's described as zealous. But in Mark's account of the second cleansing of the temple, it describes Jesus going into the temple, looking around one day, then leaving. He then returns the next day and cleanses the temple. See, it's not about Jesus losing his cool. It's about Jesus acting prophetically to teach what needed to be understood. So we can't point to Jesus and say, well, he turned over some tables and so can we. No, what we want to do is understand anger is not an emotion that will serve us well. We need to confront the anger when it appears and then respond in ways with the wisdom of God to address the wrong, but without the anger. Anger is never a good idea. Quickly, though, if I may, be careful not to presume upon God's mercy and grace. It seems as if Moses does some of that here. Maybe in the back of his mind, he thinks, I've done all that I've done for God. I'm going to do what I want to do here. And God's going to be patient with me. I think we should be grateful for God's mercy and grace. We should not presume upon God's mercy and grace. As a follower of Jesus, I know I can turn to Jesus, find forgiveness and grace. I'm grateful for that. That should not create in my mindset this attitude, well, I can still do what I want and find forgiveness. Don't presume upon God's mercy and grace. It may cost you. Next, pride, if you would consider it, can appear in the most humble of hearts. Moses is characterized to be the most humble of individuals, but not in this moment. He is pretty much trying to put himself front and forward and in a way that's elevating himself against the Lord, and that's just pride. And it would cost him. Quickly, two final thoughts. God's forgiveness abounds, but sometimes the consequences of our actions remain. I began tonight's lesson by noting that, but here we have it illustrated with Moses. Hear me say, God forgives Moses. God will continue to work through Moses. We'll see that in our final lesson next week. God's grace and mercy will make a difference in Moses' life. Yet with all of that said, Moses will not be permitted to cross over into the land with the assembly. There's consequence. We are wise to appreciate that even in our lives. Which brings me to the final thought, which will set us up for next week. Take heart, God's work of grace in Moses' life continues. Yes, Moses makes a horrible mistake, but God's not done with him. But you say he doesn't get to enter into the land with the assembly. Well, let me put a smile on your face just to appreciate the grace of God. Though Moses will not accompany the people across the river, Joshua will do that. There will come a time when Moses will enter into the land. You know when that is? It's described in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When does Moses get to enter into the land? We're informed that Jesus invites Moses and Elijah to meet him on the Mount of Transfiguration. If you look at the map, Moses is invited to enter into the land with Jesus. And even more, if you think about this scene, he is now in the land of promise with Jesus, and he listens to Jesus describe what Jesus intends to do. And what does Jesus intend to do? He intends to go to Jerusalem, to the cross, to die for humanity so that God can restore sinful humanity so that they can enjoy a relationship with him. If Moses thought it was hard doing what he did to lead the children of Israel, suddenly Moses was humbled as he listened to Jesus, the Son of God, explain, Moses, this is what leadership requires. I will go to the cross and die. So when I think about Moses, and yes, I'm sad for what his action forfeited, I remind myself he did get to enter into the land. He did so with Jesus, and we should be encouraged by that. Hope you'll be with us next week as we finish up by looking at how does Moses' life end and what do we learn from that. There are still a few remaining lessons to consider. I hope you'll be with us. Let me dismiss us in prayer. Father, thank you for these that have gathered, for those that have joined us online. Give us perspective on our own lives based upon Moses' experience. Father, when I see such a notable individual who has served you and honored you and followed you in all the ways that he did, only to stumble, allowing his emotions to get the better of him. Lord, it reminds me of all of our vulnerability. Help us to learn through that experience. Help us to realize even when we falter, you still are seeking to move us forward, to carry us along. Encourage us with that hope. Remind us of your goodness toward that end. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Be with us on Sunday. We resume our lessons in Matthew's Gospel. It would be in Matthew chapter 7. I hope you'll be a part. Have a great evening.